everybody. Dr. Dan here. Welcome back. So this week we're looking at Chapter 11, and we have like 4 themes we're going to look at. And I'm going to talk about those 4 major themes and how those relate to our 5 quiz questions. So this is really a quiz review and an overview of the chapter. And then also we'll talk about how 1 or 2 of those themes relates to one of our course learning objectives about understanding other cultures from the past and present. So let's get right to it. So in this chapter, Chapter 11, I'm looking at this chapter outline right now, and the big themes are collapse and consolidation. So what that's really talking about is the plague, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, and then the recovery from the Black Death. And I'm going to talk about that as one of our themes in relationship to COVID, but it was nothing like COVID because 25, 30, 40, 50% of the population died in some areas. So it was a lot worse with no health care whatsoever. So there's some big parallels, but we'll talk about it. And then the second theme, or the second part of the chapter, is the Islamic heartland. So we're gonna read about the Ottoman Empire a little bit and how they can teach us about diversity. And then we get into Western Christendom. So we're going to talk about we're going to talk about the Catholic Church right up to the time of Martin Luther, and then we'll conclude. We're going to talk about Ming China, and then we're going to conclude. So that's what we're going to do. So when you approach this chapter, make sure you take advantage of all the little videos in the textbook. I know the reading on stuff like this can sometimes be a little dry, although I think this book is really good, and you paid money for it. There's some good stories in here, and it makes you a well-rounded person besides just getting you ready for the quiz. So I think it's a good book, so look it over. But I am going to pull out these main themes, and I want you to pay attention to those. And I'm going to use a different screen. I don't know how it's going to switch, but let's get to it. There it is. So theme 1 here is some parallels and some thoughts between the Black Death or the bubonic plague and COVID. And there's 2 quiz questions about this. And neither one of the quiz questions really has to do with any kind of conspiracies. But I just wanted to point out, when we're talking about parallels, that when COVID came on, and to this day, there's all kinds of conspiracy theories about COVID, that it only affects certain populations, and some drugs work with some people, and all of this stuff. It was going crazy when we were at the height of the pandemic. And I find it interesting as you read through the history of the bubonic plague, way before healthcare, way before anyone knew what germs or viruses were, there were all these conspiracy theories too. And many of them were similar, like, the Jews poisoned the water, in Europe, or in places in Europe was one of them. So you have stuff like that. And then you also had these crazy reactions to it where, these guys would, the flagellants would go down the street and beat themselves with a whip. To kind of sacrifice their pain to the gods so they wouldn't get the plague, So all of these like crazy remedies and ideas, but I think it's interesting because I think they're very parallel to COVID. So that's kind of a good takeaway as we look at history, as really, yeah, we kind of care about what happened back then, but what can we learn from it and apply it to the present? And, one of them is humans love conspiracies, and there's nothing better than a pandemic, to bring out all these crazy ideas on how it happened, why it happened, and how it can be cured. So there's that. And so there's that part. I'm sorry there's this lamp in my head. I just noticed this, but we'll just have to leave it there for now. So there's 2 quiz questions having to do with the plague, and one of them is pretty easy. It's like, where did it originate and spread? So read it in the book. It has something to do with the Mongols. So I'll leave you with that. It's on page, I think, 433 or something like that. So that's one question. How did it originate and spread? And then also there's a question about the map on page 437, which is map 11.1. And it's a question about, why did the bubonic plague only spread west? Well, it depends on which way you're looking at me. But why did it only spread west? Why did it only spread in one direction? And that wasn't the case when COVID came. Everyone thinks at this point it originated from China, but because of the nature of transportation now, it just, it went everywhere all at once. But that wasn't the case with the bubonic plague. So what was different between then and now? Big hint is the Pacific Ocean. I'll leave it at that. You can figure it out. But that's the map on page 437. So there's one quiz question about this. Don't go crazy about these quiz questions. People study and they do, because that's all open book and it's not timed. And you can start it and finish it and come back to it in Blackboard. So you don't have to take notes or remember all this stuff. I just want you to kind of get the themes as we go through, so we can get something out of this. So 2 questions, both on the plague, origins, and why did it travel the way it did. Easy one, no big deal. All right, the next theme 2, is lessons about acceptance from and diversity from the Ottoman Empire. Now, I love this question or this idea, this theme, because last chapter, I believe, you did a map exercise where you saw that there were Christian settlements in certain areas. I think when I raise my hand, I get this thumbs up, so I'll stop doing that. But anyway, that there were Christian settlements in certain areas, and it indicated that the governments in those areas were more diverse and more accepting of other religions. So sorry about the long day. Other religions. So we already did a map exercise. We learned this. So now we're going to read about the Ottoman Empire in this same time period in chapter 11. And the cool thing about the Ottoman Empire is that they were all followed Islam, but they were very accepting of other religions. All right. So if you're a Muslim, Sunni, Shiite, Christian, you could all live there. Now, sometimes you had to pay a tax if you were another religion or something like that, but you could live there. And the lesson that comes out of that is that in these very diverse societies, the Ottoman Empire lasted 900 years, okay? From the time we're reading about it now all the way up to the early 1900s. So, whenever 1200s or wherever we're at. So it lasted forever. And the lesson out of that is that these diverse cultures last longer because they're not always fighting the enemy from within. If you're always worried about the people in your own society attacking you because you're not accepting to them, well, you're never going to be successful. And so when you think about the U.S. today, some people say, oh, the country's on the wrong path and all this. It may be, if you follow politics too much, it is. But as well as I do with college students, we're a very diverse society. I mean, just think if you're on campus for sure, and in your workplace, you're super diverse. And so we're a very diverse society. For the most part, everyone gets along. And it's really one of the main reasons that the U.S. has done so well and that we've been around for a few hundred years. When that diversity, when tolerance goes away, that's when the trouble starts, because you get the infighting. Hey, we want to have a civil war, all this. So the Ottoman Empire, they were very diverse, very accepting. And so the lesson is that, diversity and acceptance means you're going to have a more solid empire. So the exact question in the quiz is, what lessons can we learn from the Ottoman Empire? And it's all about sustainability and diversity. So you can figure it out. That's a real easy question. This whole quiz is easy. So the next theme is the mandate of heaven. And we could talk about the mandate of heaven or its equivalent with any of these ancient civilizations, because in almost every case, this is before modern governments. In every case, there was an emperor or king, depending on where you were at, and they all claimed to have, the blessing from God, whoever their God was, that they were in charge. And that's the way they sort of stayed mysterious to the people. People weren't as savvy back then as they are now. And so, because they weren't educated and they didn't read. And so if a god came up with a fancy outfit on and said, or a king came up with a fancy outfit on and said, I'm your king, I have this mandate from heaven, the gods have told me I'm in charge, that's how they took leadership, okay? And that all ended in the 1700s. But the reason I bring it up in this chapter is the one thing I want you to take away from Ming China, that's just an emperor period in China, is that the mandate of heaven was a thing then, and it basically was the emperor of China saying, hey, the gods have appointed me to be your ruler. Okay, so don't screw with me because the gods have me in charge. At the same time, with the mandate of heaven in China, it cut both ways. And if you did real well, if the crops came in well, there were no floods, there were no pandemics, then the emperor was looked upon favorably because nothing went wrong under his watch. But if there were floods or famine or something like that, then the emperor would be blamed for that because the gods, the gods said, hey, you're doing a bad thing, so we're punishing you. So the mandate of heaven is interesting, but I just wanted to bring up this point that during this period of time in the 12 or 1300s, regardless of the culture, China or in Europe, as we're soon going to learn, that these kings and emperors all claim to have heaven on their side. Okay, it's one of the reasons. Now, much later, it's one of the reasons in the 1700s that the U.S. broke away from England, because we're like, hey, we're not going to take orders from a king who says that he was, divinely approved to be king. We're not doing it. So it's a takeaway from Ming China. It's hard to study China in this era, but I think these big takeaways about how they tied the emperor into approval of the gods is interesting. So, and we learn this lesson that religion and leadership was always tied together in these early cultures. So theme 4 and the last quiz question is about the Catholic Church and the selling of indulgences. So in chapter 12, we're going to get into Martin Luther and the 99 Theses and all that stuff, and sort of, the breakaway, the Protestant, breakaway, the Reformation, if you will, from the Catholic Church. But chapter 11 sort of leads up to it in the sense that it says, hey, why were people getting maybe a little bit disillusioned with the church? And it was the only game in town. I mean, if you were Christian, you were Catholic. There wasn't any Protestant other, nominations back then. It was all Catholic. So the selling of indulgences is something the church that was doing that really pushed a lot of people too far. And what that was the Pope, the Catholic Church, was saying, hey, if you sinned, all right, and you're worried about not getting to heaven, if you give us some money, then it'll be okay, all right? We can kind of get you out of any kind of trouble. You'll go to heaven regardless. So it's called the selling of indulgences. And it makes sense when you think about the words. You indulge in something you shouldn't do, and you're going to sell it so you can still go to heaven. Well, it's sort of ridiculous as we look at it now. A church charging you to say, hey, you've sinned, but if you give me $10, it'll go away. So read about that, because I think it's interesting as we get to the next chapter when we think about, hey, why is there this idea that we want to break away from the church? And one of the ideas is that the church was kind of getting ridiculous. And the point being that with anything in life, if you go too far and take advantage of people, eventually people are going to wise up and say, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense at all. So those are the themes. There's a quiz question about the selling of indulgences. The exact question is, it's a true or false. And it says the selling of indulgences in the Catholic Church in the 1300s relates to the church allowing you to reduce your time in purgatory by paying the church, on page 449. So that's a freebie for you. All right, that's a true. But look it up, read about it, and think about it in terms if you went to church today and what it would be like. Okay, that's that. So again, not going through the whole chapter, just want to do this quick quiz review. If nothing else, read as much as you can. Go through those videos. They're short, and we're here to get an education, whether you think it's cool or not. So do it, look through it, take the quiz. You'll be successful. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a great day. Be safe. Go Rockets. Take care.